I must now get on tonight to introduce Professor Tim Barringer, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for longer than I should probably admit, and I promise, many of you might have heard Tim's marvellous talk last year, I won't extend my reminiscences tonight for those of you that are on a second sitting, but I just say that after degrees at Cambridge and a PhD at Sussex, studying with the wonderful Marcia Poynton, Tim, which is where I really first came into contact with Tim, he moved to the United States, where he's now Paul Mellon Professor of the History of Art at Yale University, in a position really in which he's had a transformative effect on the study of British art through his own judicious and inspired deployment of his considerable intellectual talents, but also because he's been able to marshal the not inconsiderable resources of Yale in service of a very profound and thorough rethinking of 19th century British art, which has, among other things, I think, opened it up to concerns of empire, slavery, the traffic in people and images, made it more compelling and more complete, and been able to work with fantastically gifted colleagues at Yale, such as Gillian Forrester, who's here, the curator, and that's exemplified really in Gillian and Tim and Barbara Martinez-Ruiz, Art and Emancipation in Jamaica, Isaac Mendes Belisario and His Worlds, 2007, which was really, profoundly, I think, field-altering book, and one which won a number of prizes, including the Alfred Barr Prize of the College Art Association. But this is just one of a number of Tim's very important publications from the still very often read and cited Reading the Pre-Raphaelites from 1998, and his, I think, very field-changing book, Men at Work, Art and Labour in Victorian Britain, 2005. And in addition to this, Tim has also pursued, and that's just to name some of his publications, but he's also been very interested in a wide range of topics in intellectual and cultural history, including the relationship between art and music in Britain. And he gave the prestigious Slade Lectures at Cambridge in 2009 on the subject of Broken Pastoral, art and music in Britain from Gothic Revival to punk. And many of you will have heard a section of that when he gave his talk so insightfully on Elgar and Vaughan Williams last year. But we're all looking forward to that emerging. And it's just a sign of the depth and breadth of Tim's intellectual interests. He's currently working on, as I said, the creation of a very ambitious Art in the British Empire show, which really has major aims to try to sort of articulate a new kind of view of art in the British Empire, which isn't, I think, until 2020. But before that, he's curating an exhibition of British landscape, pastures green and dark satanic mills, which tours the United States, and he's always involved in many projects. But aside from that, he's really been a great former, and as many of you sitting in this room will know, Tim has had a great role in teaching and encouraging and mentoring students at all stages, from undergraduate through advanced postgraduate and beyond. And it's really, he's become a very important person in the continuing vitality of British art in its most sophisticated and I think disciplinarily challenging forms across not just in the United States, but across a wide spectrum of the English-speaking world. So it's a delight to have him back, and his lecture today is really, as I say, a fitting opening to our event about memorial and memory, and the way in which particularly war experience is marked in landscape and in memory. And he's, in a way, in this lecture, he's returning us to Sussex, to ground very well known to both Tim and me, to the beautiful chalk downs, to talk about an architectural monument perhaps not very well known to everyone, but which, planned as it was in 1915, I think will resonate very aptly with the memorializing of Gallipoli that we're sort of exploring in our symposium, which, as I say, has been organized by Mary and by Andrew Yip. So that, I'm really hoping that many of you will join us for the next day and a half, but I'm delighted that I can introduce Tim's talk tonight, which is entitled, as you see, Empire Mourning, the Patcham Chattri, and the Architecture of Imperial Ambivalence. Please welcome Tim Barringer.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, and it's wonderful to be here in Sydney again. I would say that our intellectual dialogue between Yale and the University of Sydney is really one of the most beneficial and important things. It's been great to have Mary Roberts with us in the last 2 weeks in New Haven, and now to see her again here. And it's always wonderful to keep these conversations going, and it was great to have a symposium just in the last 2 hours with our graduate students and faculty from both institutions meeting and talking. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm not going to speak about Gallipoli tonight, and it would be absolutely mistaken for me to claim any expertise in that particular field, but I look forward to sharing some of the objects in the collections here with the members of the conference tomorrow, and I'm also looking forward to the exhibition co-curated by Andrew Yip. But what I'm going to talk about today, can we have maybe the lights down, is indeed, I don't know how to do that, but wow, he can do it without even seeing it. That's impressive. Okay, perfect. Yes. Actually, no. Sorry. That's good. Yeah, that's fine. So I am going to talk about the First World War and memory. And I wanted to open by remembering my two grandfathers, who you see on the screen, who were in uniform in the summer of 1918. And of course, had they been called to the Western Front, I probably would not be here to speak with you. But their stories of the war, of their brothers and cousins who died in it, live with me. And that's one of the reasons why I found this such a fascinating project to undertake. So high above the seaside town of Brighton, in southern England, on a remote and windswept eminence of the Sussex Downs, above the small hamlet of Patcham, stands the Chattri. It's a simple white structure fashioned from Sicilian marble, its domed roof supported by 8 slender columns. Such a refined design seems at first sight drastically at odds with its rustic surroundings, and today cattle and sheep graze undisturbed around its base. Situated in a landscape that's the very epitome of Englishness, the Chattri has come to resemble a picturesque gazebo, one of those ruins or follies that were central to the British Romantic painting and the tropes of British landscape gardening. Its position in the landscape resembles that of Raby Castle in Turner's panoramic canvas of 1819, and the downland topography is resonant with historical associations that fascinated artists of the Romantic era. Just a few miles up the coastline is the site of the Battle of Hastings, the spot where Harold fell, as Turner called it, the subject of this engraving from Turner's picturesque views of England and Wales. And there's one of these examples of the same kind of placing of a monument in the landscape at Stourhead. Yet, embedded as it is in English landscape and history, the Chattri stands above all for India. It is a quiet but insistent reminder of the presence of empire in British life, and specifically of the involvement of imperial troops in the Great War. Unveiled in February 1921, the Chattri is a memorial to the Hindu and Sikh soldiers of the Indian Army who died in hospitals in Brighton as a result of wounds received in the French and Belgian battlefields of the First World War. It's located near the spot where they were cremated. And I want to argue today that the history and the architectural form of this unusual memorial poignantly encapsulate the paradoxes of imperial participation in the Great War. The symbolic project of this monument, widely recognized at the moment of its unveiling in 1921, was, by honoring the contribution of Indian troops among the family of imperial forces in the Great War, to assert the bonds between Britain and India at a time in 1921 of mounting political tensions. The micro-history of the Chattri documents local efforts to commemorate a group of 53 men through a simple monument, no more ambitious than the war memorials in hundreds of towns across Britain. Yet, I shall argue, in a broader context, the monument can be seen as a palimpsest of Anglo-Indian relations throughout the whole of the last century, the 20th century. At the core of my paper is an examination of the architectural form of the Chattri, whose complex genealogy reveals a deep imbrication of both Muslim and Hindu traditions of architecture, and indeed of Indian and British cultures, resulting in a monument whose meanings are unstable and profoundly ambivalent. The British Army in India was a vast human resource, shaped from the three presidency armies into a single massive unit. In 1914, the Indian forces ranked as the largest volunteer army in the world, amounting to 236,000 men. In addition to 159,000 Indian officers and men, there were approximately 2,300 British officers, a tiny group at the top, whom, as the historian David Omissi has documented, quote, occupied the middle and higher echelons of command. 39 regiments of cavalry and 118 infantry battalions were recruited in India, while 20 battalions of Gurkha rifles derived from Nepal. And there were 68,000 British infantry also stationed in the subcontinent. So this whole sprawling organization was known as the Army in India. It had never fought outside Asia before 1914, since a policy amounting to a color bar, that's inverted commas, had prevented the participation of Indian troops in the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902. And there was deep resistance to the idea of Indian troops engaging in the European theatre of war. This persisted until August 1914. But Viscount Hardinge, the Viceroy of India, was adamant that the inclusion of Indian troops in the conflict would encourage loyalty to the empire in the subcontinent in the face of persistent nationalist agitation through the decades before 1914. In any case, the desperate shortage of men, of troops for the Western Front, forced the hand of the authorities. Orders were given in late August, and the first Indian divisions, inaugurating the new India Corps, arrived in October 1914. On the right is a rare studio portrait of an individual Indian soldier, Corporal Venkatasamy of the Queen's Own Madras Sappers. He fought on the Western Front, he fought in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, where this photograph was taken in February 1918. He wears the standard khaki drill tunic and shorts, and on his left sleeve are stripes for good conduct and long service, 12 years, which he was lucky to survive. In 1914, on the left, a group of Indian soldiers are seen marching to the front, the same scene that was captioned in a magnificent bilingual French postcard of October 1914, "Gentlemen of India marching to chasten those German hooligans." No ideological overlay there at all. By the end of 1914, almost 1/3 of the British expeditionary force in France and Belgium was made up of Indian soldiers, a fact which has been almost completely forgotten in the commemorations in Britain this year. Meanwhile, recruitment in India was dramatically increased, and by November 1918, the army in India had more than doubled in size to over 500,000 men. By the armistice, the Punjab alone had contributed 360,000 recruits. And of course, Indian troops were trained and equipped for the subcontinent, but not for European warfare. Yet, by the end of 1915, the number of Indian army soldiers who had served on the Western Front had already reached 30,000. The underlying principles of recruitment and organization of the Indian regiments were derived from colonial ethnography, which had long been codified in publications like The People of India, which I show on the screen, compiled by John Forbes Watson in 1868 to 75. Allegedly warlike and martial races, according to this colonial ethnography, were preferred for the army, and soldiers were segregated along lines of religion or caste, or rather those lines as they were understood by the British. The expeditionary force in the Western Front consisted of 6 battalions of Nepali Gurkhas, highly regarded by the British as warfaring men, 2 battalions of Garhwalis from the foothills of the Himalaya, and 4 battalions of Sikhs. Most of the remaining units were mixed battalions, typically with separate companies within them identified individually as Sikh, Punjabi Muslim, Rajput, or Maratha. And as the brilliant literary historian Shantanu Das has recently demonstrated, Indian soldiers were acutely aware of the unthinking racism of the British Army, although there was a wide variety of motivations. Nonetheless, in spite of that problem, there were a wide variety of motivations for volunteering to enter the carnage. The censored letters of wounded sepoys in Shantanu Das's book provide a vivid insight into the conditions in the trenches. But the diary of the Rajput aristocrat Thakur Amar Singh reveals in Das's analysis a fantastically complex mixture of internalized imperial ideology, traditional concepts of honor and fighting for the nation, and resentment against the poor conditions and the continual slurs, that's the word coming from this diary, slurs against Indian soldiers on the part of British officers. A large visual archive records the presence of Indian soldiers in the European theatre of war. Here, turbaned members of Hodson's Horse are seen on the Western Front in 1915 in a spectacular photograph. The Bengal Lancers, as they were known, were a highly skilled and highly trained force, but their form of warfare yielded terrible casualties in the face of machine gun fire. They were instructed to charge straight into oncoming machine gun fire. Their uniform and discipline in this photograph from 1915, with its stark geometry, it's almost like a Parthenon frieze of the 1915 Lancers, contrasts with this anarchic band of the same regiment in Felice Beato's famous photograph from 1858. But this photograph takes us to one of the underlying themes of Indian participation in the First World War, namely memories of the Indian Rebellion, or mutiny, from 1858. These echoes can be detected throughout my lecture, both in the lingering forms that condition visual representation of Indian soldiers, and in British attitudes to the sepoy, the Indian soldier in service of the British Empire. More fully than in any previous conflict, photographs document the re-equipping and retraining of Indian forces for modern trench warfare, and the use of the gas mask is the most spectacular. The disjuncture here between the Indian uniforms, the uncanny new technology of the gas mask, and the timeless northern European landscape in the background seems to prefigure the position of the Chattri, this monument, which is a combination of alterity and sameness, of rootedness and displacement, imbrication and alienation that characterizes the Indian experience of the Great War. And I particularly want to dwell on this intimate photograph, and we don't know the name of the photographer, of Bengalis from the 41st Infantry in a trench. This was taken in 1915. The cameraman makes a brilliant formal equivalent of both the claustrophobia of the trenches and the tension of waiting for action that characterized trench warfare. And I'm particularly looking at a rhythmic passage. I don't think I have a pointer, but if you just look at the center of the image, the rhythmic passage of the rifles and slats that seem to mark receding time, almost like musical rhythm, as well as receding space, lead us eventually in the distance to the natural world, blurred and overexposed in a burst of Turnerian light. This world of the natural seems entirely lost and unobtainable from down in the trenches. By the end of that year, at least 3,000 of the 30,000 Indian troops in combat had been killed, and 14,000, that's almost half the entire number, injured. In other words, more than half the soldiers that came to Europe entered the official record as wounded or killed within a period of 6 months. Official photographs show a well-organized and properly equipped medical staff presiding remotely over this tragedy. And that's what we're looking at on the screen. But of course, in fact, chaos and filth were ubiquitous, gangrene and other infections commonplace. Morale suffered, and a particular locus and focus of anger was the practice of returning wounded soldiers to the trenches as quickly as possible. The military censors were sufficiently alarmed by the situation to allow, through their cordon sanitaire, a petition from the Indian sick in hospital. That's the person by whom this is signed. An Indian sick in hospital. It was addressed to England, the Emperor. And this is the text. let no one except the king open this letter. Your Majesty's order was that a man who had been wounded once should be allowed to return to India, or that if he had recovered, he should not be made to serve again. The heart of India is broken. Any man who comes here wounded is returned thrice and 4 times to the trenches. Only that man goes to India who has lost an arm or a leg or an eye. Close quotes. Indian casualties remained extremely high the following year. And in this photograph, we can see the 2nd Indian Cavalry Division muster at the Battle of the Somme. One can only imagine how many in this cavalry charge directly into machine gun fire would survive. From the earliest stages of the war, it was clear that specific medical arrangements were needed for Indian troops, which would acknowledge the dietary and other cultural requirements of the various groups that made up the Indian army. The Sussex resort town of Brighton, conveniently positioned to receive the incoming wounded from ports along the south coast, became the main destination for wounded Indian soldiers. The Brighton Workhouse, a dismal building until recently inhabited by the indigent of the district, was renamed with great celebration the Kitchener Indian Hospital and was made over for medical use. 2 local schools were repurposed as hospital wards, and the arrival of the first wounded soldiers was watched by an eager crowd, which you can see here, and widely reported in the press. But most importantly and most bizarrely, the Royal Pavilion, Dome and Corn Exchange, Brighton's exuberant architectural monuments to royal excess of the Regency era, were converted to hospitals, providing 774 beds. The Brighton Gazette in 1914 took time to, quote, wonder at the fact that the greatest of British pleasure towns has been made the centre of the greatest hospital system in the kingdom. Now, you can see there were rich ironies in the reuse of the Prince Regent's Pleasure Palace, his special, dirty weekend centre in Brighton, whose design by John Nash in 1815 to 22 utilized an elaborate Orientalist style, much influenced by Thomas and William Daniels' watercolors and aquatints of Indian monuments such as the Taj Mahal. Its reuse as a hospital is deeply ironic. It's been many times stated, although I've still to actually pin this down in a primary source, that the palace, which was in the personal gift of the crown, was actually given for the use of Indian soldiers specifically because King George V thought they would feel at home there, which is really kind of bizarre. It's delectable, though this idea is, that the idea that regiments recruited from the ranks of Punjabi farmers would feel at home in an orientalized pleasure palace on the south coast of England. Nonetheless, I wish it was true. I hope it's true. I'm sure this is completely typical of working class accommodation in the Punjab. There was at some level a deliberate effort to convince wounded servicemen, quite incorrectly, that the King Emperor had himself lived in this palace and had vacated it specifically for them. That's what they were told. And an extensive campaign of official photography documented the care with which they were treated. And we can see here the music room, which has been repurposed as a hospital ward, and you can see the connections here between these 2 images. But this, I think, is one of the most haunting images to emerge from this period. Here we can see the photography which was intended to document the care with which Indian soldiers were being treated. But it seems to me that the static figures in these photographs often simply emerge as bemused and displaced, awaiting their fate amid the cataclysm of nations. Another photograph, certainly not intended for publications, but from the private archive of the medical service, is this one, captioned "The 4 Worst Cases in the Brighton Hospital." It records the injuries of 2 sepoys and 2 Gurkhas, who appear to be barely more than boys. The poise with which they confront the camera, despite their mutilated bodies, is, I think, quite haunting. There was believed to be great propaganda value in circulating at least some images of the injured troops enjoying the benefits of good medical treatment. a manifestation of imperial benevolence and equal-handedness. For example, the Corporation of Brighton published in 1915 a short history in English and Urdu of the Royal Pavilion and a description of it as a hospital for Indian soldiers, an elaborate bilingual propaganda effort which was intended for circulation in India as well as among the wounded and their families. In another medium, the local painter Charles Burley was allowed, or perhaps even commissioned, although I haven't been able to find documents of that, to paint this doubly exotic scene. And although these works don't seem to be exhibited during the war, they certainly provide a vivid simulacrum of what actually the inside of the palace looked like in this period. This seems to me to be a display of what David Cannadine calls ornamentalism, some kind of attempt to allude to a kind of global upper-class connection through the display of exotic Eastern motifs. The Punjabi soldiers' turbans have more in common with the spick and span white bed linen than with the outrageous chinoiserie swags of John Nash's interior, though, it seems to me. Among the features most widely reported was the authorities' scrupulousness in observing, some might say essentializing and exaggerating, the religious and caste sensitivities of the soldiers with regard to the preparation of food, bathing, and sanitation. There were distinct water supplies for Hindu and Muslim in each ward. Bathing houses and latrines were segregated. An encampment of so-called untouchables, today referred to as Dalits, positioned outside the building, were tasked with cleaning the latrines. Separate kitchens catered respectively to Muslims, meat-eating Hindus, and vegetarians. And we're looking here at the Sikh kitchen with the chapatis in preparation, photographed with official permission by the Canadian H.D. Girdwood, who later became an official photographer on the Western Front. Some of the doctors in the hospital were Indian medical students, and again, care was taken to document this photographically. The attentiveness to differences of religion and caste, of course, conformed to late Victorian social Darwinist ethnography, but it also revealed a deep anxiety of the authorities reaching right back to the mutiny of 1857-8, whose ostensible cause was the army's alleged insensitivity to the use of animal grease for new cartridges in that period. Care was taken to maximize the familiarity of the hospital and its inmates to the local community by holding paid open days. And for anyone missing the message of civic benevolence, the local artist Charles Phelp provided a rudimentary iconography in which the mayor, John Otter, appears beneath a faux Mughal arch, creating a large halo behind his head. This is the good guy, in case you were wondering. And he welcomes sepoys on bended knee into the pavilion. The majority of soldiers were actually accommodated in the dome, built in 1805-8 in loose imitation of Thomas Daniel's aquatint of the Jami Masjid in Delhi, which had been published in 1795. And again, a series of official photographs, paintings by Burley and by the more ambitious painter Douglas Fox Pitt, emphasize the seamless transition from Regency Orientalism and the uniforms of the turbans and of the wounded soldiers who inhabited this space. There's a sense from these pictures that the British at least believed that in some bizarre way the troops were at home in Brighton. And there's a telling echo between the Army of India uniforms, in the blue, picked out in blue down here, and the blue architectural detailing in the dome's decor. The national and imperial media eagerly covered carefully staged events like the visit of the king to the hospital, where, like Jesus Christ, in a modest comparison, he touches the chest of a mutilated and deeply, powerfully wounded Indian soldier. And Lord Kitchener also made an appearance. The idea was that the Brighton hospitals could send a message not just through Britain, but more importantly, a message to India, where Harding had feared an uprising in 1914. A message, moreover, was sent to Germany, a visual and demotic reminder that the population and manpower of the British Empire far exceeded that of the small island of Great Britain itself, or islands, I should say. And further research would be needed to establish the extent and efficacy of such reports actually in India. We just don't know whether they made it through. The actual experience of Indian soldiers in Brighton was by no means a utopian precursor to multicultural Britain of the future, although that's the way it's been treated in some recent accounts. The inmates in the hospitals were effectively imprisoned. They were not allowed to leave the grounds without or meet people of Brighton unless accompanied by a British officer. Supervised outings were manipulated for propaganda purposes, as in this magnificent postcard, whose caption, "East to West for the Motherland," positions a group of Indian soldiers beneath a formidable sculptural monument to the grandmother of empire. In 1915, The Graphic ran an article, undoubtedly managed by propaganda officials, purporting to depict spontaneous encounters between the wounded Indians and the local children, their hands affectionately clasped in a surprising emblem of cross-racial interaction. An image whose demonstrable artifice contributes to its striking modernity. The frieze in this image, a frieze of figures are silhouetted against brilliant light. And at the fulcrum of the composition, I'm looking at the figure in the center here, is the central male figure, his brilliant smile standing at the center of this image, seen without a turban. This is perhaps what Roland Barthes defined as the punctum, the detail in a photograph that seals its authority, an element too indexical, too circumstantial to derive purely from convention. Whatever propagandistic uses it was put to, that joyful smile does indeed seem to enshrine, more directly perhaps even than the Chattri, which I'm going to come on to talk about, an emotional connection between the wounded soldiers and the city and people of Brighton. The hospitals were extremely effective in preserving the lives of their patients. Of the 4,306 Indians wounded to arrived at Brighton, there were only 74 casualties, carefully detailed in the official record as 21 Muslim and 53 Sikh and Hindu. Nonetheless, Sur ad-Din, who was the head of the Muslim faith in England at the time, warned in 1914 of, quote, the very grave danger of allowing the impression to gain ground in India that England is not showing sufficient respect to the memory of her Indian war heroes. So after initial reluctance, the British authorities soon began to display some sensitivity to funerary traditions. The Muslim dead were transported to the already extant Shah Jahan Mosque at Woking, a Victorian Orientalist confection built in 1889. A substantial motor cortege was put together, comprising a hearse and 2 lorries carrying up to 50 mourners for the funerals. After funerary ceremonies in Woking, the bodies were interred at a newly consecrated Muslim burial ground at Horsell Common, nearby, designed by the India Office surveyor, Herbert Winnie. Both structures still exist today and are still in use. The burial ground was funded by the War Office as an explicit response to German propaganda claiming that Muslim soldiers were being treated and buried improperly by the British. The aim here was to promote the German alliance with Turkey as constituting an Islamic holy war. Such propaganda was aimed directly at disenchanted Muslim soldiers on the Western Front fighting for the British Empire. Among the authorities in London, there was considerable anxiety about the possibility of a global jihad being declared, and the War Office circulated photographs such as this one of the Muslim cemetery in demonstration of British respect for Islamic custom. But it was the larger number of Hindu and Sikh dead that were accorded greater attention at both local and national level. It was decided that cremations should take place according to custom in the open air, but, and here the British authorities intervened, at a remote location so as not to awaken too much curiosity. A spot was chosen 500 feet above sea level on the Sussex Downs on an inaccessible path above the village of Patcham, which was beyond the limits of Brighton's suburbs. 3 slabs of concrete were laid, and 53 cremations were held there between the 31st of December 1914 and the 30th of December 1915. An anonymous correspondent of the Times newspaper was invited to attend the cremations, again clearly a move orchestrated by the War Office. He attended the rites for Mohia Ram, a member of the Supply and Transport Corps, lately employed as a storekeeper at the Kitchener Hospital in Brighton. He was a Brahmin, and the funeral, attended by enough mourners to fill 2 ambulances, is described in the Times in great detail. Firstly, modern technology intervened in the ancient ritual. I quote, "Before the body was put into the big black motor hearse, a photographer was brought to come and take a picture of the dead man's features to be sent to his relatives in India. He was then taken, I quote again, through the intensely English village of Patcham with its church and duck pond, up to the burning gut in the Downs. The contrast could hardly be more pronounced to that of the most celebrated of ghats, the Manika cremation ghat in the holy city of Varanasi, then known as Benares. But the practice was the same. As the Times reporter put it, it's a long quote, "The body under its bright pall and the chrysanthemums lay outside on the grassy slope." This shows you the site, where the preparations had been made and the mourners gathered around. The body was sprinkled with cleansing water, the face was exposed again, and honey and ghee and minute portions of 8 metals and other ritual things were passed between the pale lips. Then the mourners gathered round in a semicircle, squatting on their haunches with their hands folded and their eyes downcast, chanting their sing-song chants, now shrill, now soft, now a murmur, then a shout. At last came the time of burning. When all was ready, the body was laid on the pyre. Crystals of camphor were lighted in a spoon on the end of a long pole, and when they were flaming well, were poured into the center of the fire. A flame leapt up, and soon the whole pyre was ablaze, and with it, and while it burned, the mourners kept tossing upon it little pinches of ghee mixed with grains of fruit, scent, saffron, and spices. The rhetoric here mixes breathless Orientalist rapture with ethnographic precision of detail. The text carefully calibrates the requirement of British and possible Indian readers. The impact of the description rests on the contradiction between the English duck pond and the Indian saffron and ghee, an oxymoronic vision of empire compressing the global and the local in one single picturesque vista. The cremations, which briefly lit up the Sussex skyline during 1914 and 15, were Indian and British, military and civilian, secular and sacred, public and private. They ceased swiftly in 1915 when the India Corps was redeployed to the Mesopotamian front, where they fought alongside the Australians, and the flow of wounded Indian soldiers to Brighton ceased entirely. The last Indian wounded departed from the pavilion in February 1916, and the facilities were redeployed for the use of British amputees. But as early as August 1915, Lieutenant Das Gupta of the Indian Medical Service had approached the mayor of Brighton, we've already met him, John Otter, asking permission to place a memorial on the site of the cremations. Otter, concerned to memorialize Brighton's unique role in the relation to the war and the empire, took up the scheme and pursued it to fulfillment despite many formidable obstacles. The memorial also had national and imperial significance. Sir Walter Lawrence, King's Commissioner with responsibility for the welfare of Indian troops, noted in a memorandum to the India Office of 1915 December, it would be wise on political and historical grounds to take a great deal of care and some money on preserving the memory of the Indians who died in France and England. And this recommendation was endorsed by Austin Chamberlain, Secretary of State for India. It was agreed that the India Office and the Brighton Corporation should split between them the cost of erecting an appropriate memorial. But what kind of memorial? In his book Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning, J. Winter sets up a compelling typology in which war memorials inhabit 3 distinctive spaces and periods. First, scattered over the home front before 1918. Second, in post-war churches and civic sites in the next decade. And third, in the great war cemeteries of Europe, continental Europe. The Chattri carries elements of each of these but conforms to none. It was completed After the armistice, it stands as a public monument, but is in a remote location, not a cemetery. It nonetheless stands as a marker of the place of cremation. Moreover, it is an Indian structure as much as it is a British one, and its appeal was for the fallen and the relatives of the fallen, and for the people of India generally, as Austen Chamberlain put it in 1915, rather than for the people of Brighton. Perhaps following India Office advice, John Otter contacted the retired architect Sir Swinton Jacob, whose official buildings in India established the Indo-Saracenic style as the house style of the British Raj. Born into an East India Company family in 1841, Jacob was commissioned into the Bombay Artillery in the last stages of the uprising of 1858, another echo of the mutiny in the history of the Chattri. And he became chief engineer of the state of Jaipur in 1867. And you can see examples of his work here, the Lakshmi Niwas Palace in Bikaner, and on the bottom, the Delhi College in Indore. These give a sense of his eclectic and highly elaborate architectural style, which principally used motifs adapted from Islamic architecture, but in a completely British grammar of architecture, drawing those details together. He quoted onion domes, pointed arches, minarets, and particularly the chaja, the eave laid on cantilevered brackets, which projected out from the wall, which you can see here in the great tomb in Fatehpur Sikri, built in 1580, and paraphrased, that's at the top left, and paraphrased here, I'm talking about this, in the great museum that he built that Swinton Jacob built in Jaipur, the Museum of Industrial Arts, built for the Maharaja of Jaipur. But perhaps the most distinctive element of Swinton Jacob's architecture was his extensive use of the Chattri, or dome-shaped pavilion. And Indo-Saracenic architecture, this was used purely decoratively. You can see it here in the museum on each corner of the building, in the museum in Jaipur, and again in his magnificent St. John's College in Agra, where it takes the place of the great dome, which is found in so many neoclassical and Baroque structures, such as St. Peter's, for example. And it seems to have been Swinton Jacob who suggested the Chattri as an appropriate form for the Patcham Memorial, though the assertion attributed to him that it was a traditional Indian style of memorial is highly questionable, since it simply isn't. At 75, Jacob had only 2 years to live, and rather than take on this commission, he recommended a young Indian architect just finishing his studies in London, Mr. E.C. Henriques. We know very little about Henriques, who came from Bombay and was perhaps a member of the Christian community in that city. He later became president of the Institute of Indian Architects in 1939. His design was completed, in any rate, at 1917, and he created a monument in a powerful and austere style, far less ornate than that of Swinton Jacob. Henriques' Chattri is closely derived from Mughal architecture, which reached its zenith in the 16th and 17th century, itself a distinctive hybrid that added the forms of local Hindu traditions to the forms of Islamic architecture that had already been established in India under the Delhi Sultanate, and was added to by craftsmen that the Mughals brought with them from Central Asia. The Chattri shares the lotus finial, and you can see these on this convenient thing that I found on Wikipedia, which will do fine. The Chattri shares the lotus finial, the low rounded dome, the drum, the overhanging chaja, which we've talked about, the decorated lintels, the slender, elegant pillars, and the octagonal base of the Mughal counterpart. So Chattri on the left, Mughal counterpart on the right. But it's important to note that the Chattri was never a freestanding monument, but a decorative element in larger compositions. Thus, in the great palace at Fatehpur Sikri, built by Akbar in 1571 to 85, the skyline is dotted with Chattris, but they are elements in a building, particularly in the great Panch Mahal, or Palace of the Winds. Octagonal Chattris can be seen on the Red Fort in Delhi, Shah Jahan, 1638, and it was next to a white marble Chattri in the Red Fort at Delhi, begun by, in the Red Fort at Delhi, that the King Emperor George VI, the only reigning monarch ever to visit India, greeted his imperial subjects in 1911, wearing the crown of India on the only day it was ever worn. The Chattri is not exclusively associated with Mughal or Muslim architecture, however, which makes it especially appropriate for this particular purpose in Sussex. The Rajput palaces of Rajasthan, such as the Amber Fort, the seat of a Hindu royal dynasty, are decorated with numerous Chattris, mainly added in the 17th century. And intriguingly, and this is a miniature from the same period, and intriguingly, the Chattri was recently reinvented and revived in the context of a vast and controversial monumental scheme constructed by Mayawati, the Dalit chief minister of Uttar Pradesh. These were built in 2007, new Chattris in India. Chattris were also associated with memorials. The most important Mughal monument in Delhi was Humayun's tomb, begun 1569. You can see the Chattris on the upper parapet, built in red sandstone. And of course, the Taj Mahal, whose use of white marble surely determined the choice for the Brighton Chattri. And yet the small Chattris on the parapet of the Taj are not close in form to Henriques' design. But of course, there is a connection here which links the Chattri with its exuberant neighbor, the Brighton Pavilion, which is a kind of grotesque echo of the Taj Mahal. Perhaps because the practice of burial rather than cremation, mausolea are far more important in Muslim than in Hindu and Sikh culture, and hence perhaps the need to appropriate a Mughal form for a monument to the dead. Henriques knew probably of this one major exception, the Hindu mausolea at Orcha, sometimes known as the Great Chattris. These haunting riverside structures were well known during the British Raj, thanks to this superb and melancholy photograph by Lala Deen Dayal, taken in 1882 and circulated in an album of views of places proposed to be visited by Lord Curzon in 1902. That's how they became famous. The closest precedent for the memorial use of the individual Chattri, however, can be found in one of the strangest and most haunted sites of the British Raj, the Nicholson Cemetery in Delhi. Here are found bizarre Christian tombs in the shape of a miniature Taj Mahal, and Chattris serve as sepulchral monuments for British soldiers and officials, complete with the whole thing, lotus, finial, dome, drum, and chaja, but used for Christian tombs. An example of the already hybrid Mughal style being shamelessly re-hybridized by the British. And there were also surprisingly precedents for the use of the Chattri on British soil, though for entirely decorative purposes. Sesinkert House in Gloucestershire, designed in 1805 by Samuel Pepys Cockerell for his brother Charles of the East India Company, has Chattris there on the facade. And indeed, there they are at the Brighton Pavilion itself, where they take on a Gothicized fairy tale look. The Victorian era saw the appropriation of the Chattri in cast iron, in one more bizarre structure, the Maharaja's Well, a cast iron gift in 1864 from the Maharaja of Benares to the village of Stoke Row in Oxfordshire, in thanks for the activities of the local squire, Edward Reed, on his tour of duty in India. Swinton Jacob himself designed the Jaipur Gate, a decorative structure made in Indian teak, exhibited at the 1886 Colonial and Indian Exhibition, and, redundant afterwards, dumped in a park in Hove, not 10 miles from the Chattri, where it has withstood the British weather since 1926. My point in delivering this extended typology of the Chattri is to emphasize the lack of stable historical meanings for this architectural form. By 1900, the British Raj had made one final appropriation of the Chattri that, despite its geographical distance, is of great significance for our interpretation of the Patcham monument. From the creation of the title of Empress of India in 1877, the celebration of Durbars became an event ever more significant for the British Raj. The native princes were, so-called, and that's in inverted commas, were summoned to, quote, pay feasance to the King Emperor or Queen Empress's representative. In 1877, John Lockwood Kipling, the father of Rudyard Kipling, created this Mughal Gothic pavilion. but a far grander 1903 Durbar was mounted to celebrate the coronation of Edward VII, an event that cost many more times than his coronation in London. The grandiose Lord Curzon as Viceroy appeared where else? Beneath a Chattri. And on an even grander scale, in 1911, the Durbar, the only one to be attended in person by a monarch, saw George V seated beneath this elegant iron structure that recalled somehow both the Taj Mahal and the Brighton Pavilion. The king's slight form could hardly be seen from across the vast spaces of the Durbar, particularly because he insisted on riding on a horse, not an elephant, so no one knew who he was, and he didn't even get a round of applause when he appeared. But he sat unmistakably under the dome of the Chattri in 1911 at the Durbar. This was I should mention also that the word Chattri also means umbrella or parasol, an emblem used by Indian rulers of all traditions, reaching back as far as Buddha himself. And you can see an example in this painting from the 18th century. So the idea of the royal connotations of the Chattri are very clear at the 1911 Delhi Durbar. And these were transmitted by photographic means throughout the empire, and significantly by the new technology of film, including these extraordinary hand-colored films of the Durbar and the Chattri. At the Durbar, George V announced the return of the capital of India from Calcutta to the Mughal capital of Delhi. Now, let me just see if I can share with you for 1 second a very brief clip from this film. You just get a second. Hang on, there it is, of the Chattri. There it is. And you see how it was used. The ruling chiefs of India were forced to mount the steps, walk underneath the Chattri, bow to the king, and move backwards, respectfully having paid homage. But the Gaikwar of Baroda did almost the right thing in walking up and bowing, but then caused consternation by, wait for it, turning his back on the king emperor. And at that moment, the British Empire was, on its way down and out, quite rightly. But I do think those films are quite extraordinary, visceral memorials to this culture of grandeur in these Durbars. At the Durbar, George V announced the return of the capital of India from Calcutta to the Mughal capital city of Delhi, or rather, to this new site that would become called New Delhi, outside the old city. The apotheosis of the Raj's use of the Chattri can be found in the buildings whose early designs by Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker predate the Great War, but whose construction was delayed until the 1920s. So this was designed before our Chattri, but built after it. The great central axis of the British Empire's greatest planned city is flanked by Chattris. And like the Mughal palaces that it emulates, the architecture of New Delhi is marked out by Chattris, many of which very closely resemble those of our Sussex example. And here is proof that the sun did occasionally set over the British Empire, no matter what you may have been told. And this is the most modern Chattri, which I rather enjoy, which is a movable traffic Chattri in current contemporary New Delhi. The most significant monuments were placed along this massive central axis of New Delhi that you can see very clearly in these maps. And the first and most important one was a Triumphal Arch, a classical monument to soldiers lost in the Great War, many times the size of Lutyens' cenotaph in London. Early designs followed even more closely Roman precedents, but the single great arch in pale brick, 42 meters tall, is a structure of distinctive modernity. It commemorates the 70,000 Indian soldiers who died in the conflict, but significantly only bears the names of the 13,516 British soldiers who died in the Indian army. There are no Indian names on this memorial. The gate was aligned in Lutyens' plan, as you can see from the map, with, guess what, a Chattri. And its extended height, this canopy of extended height, was based actually on a Hindu structure at Mahabalipuram, depicted by William and Thomas Daniel in the 1790s. Now, crucially, this new sort of super high Chattri in New Delhi was not intended to be empty as all the Chattris we've seen so far. Rather, it was designed to accommodate a vast statue of the King Emperor George V, 12 meters tall, made by Charles Sargent Jacker. Needless to say, Ozymandias-like, this statue was removed shortly after independence. But no agreement could be made about a replacement. Even Gandhi was considered too controversial. And to this day, the Chattri remains vacant. It returns the architectural form to its proper emptiness. But the final appropriation of the Chattri in the service of the ideology of the British Raj was intended to symbolize the eternal presence of the British in India, and it lasted 22 years. King George was moved back to the site of the 1911 Durbar, where 6 years ago I saw him musing in solitude, abandoned in the unkempt scrub, a melancholy emblem of imperial overreach, hubris, and nemesis. But I'd like to end on that Byronic note. But the processes of global capitalism do not accommodate such poignant musings for long. When I returned in 2012 with a group of Yale students, the trees had been cleared and the sculpture was undergoing some rather inexpert repairs, as you can see, prior to the opening of the King George V shopping mall and visitor park, an emblem of the new India. Such are the ironies of history. We are far now from the Sussex Downs, where, to the frustration of the now knighted ex-mayor of Brighton, Sir John Otter, the struggles of local contractors to extract white Sicilian marble from war-damaged Italy delayed the construction of the Chattri until 1920. When finally Henriques' simple design took physical form, it became a site of mourning for the Indian troops. But in accordance with the architectural history of the Chattri, it was much more legible as a symbol of the British Empire in India. The opening ceremony held in February 1921 was replete with symbolism. It opened with a 21-gun salute. The charismatic young Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII, King Emperor, I should say, paid tribute, as the Mirror put it, to our Indian heroes. If the crowd present on the Sussex Downs that cold, blustery February day was a local one, perhaps including individuals who'd forged personal links with some of those Indian soldiers many years earlier, the intended audience for the event was global. And once again, the press was there in force, as were cinema cameras. Let's just watch the Prince of Wales unveiling the Chattri, a domed Hindu monument. And here he is marching up the stairs, and we see the moment of the unveiling in 1921. Strangely, the political climate in 1921 had shifted dramatically from that in 1914. At the beginning of the war, when the King Emperor George V declared war on Germany in the name of the entire empire, there'd been a surprising unanimity of support, even from nationalist politicians in India. But in 1921, the keynote of these events, the opening of the unveiling, was to emphasize British sensitivities to the new atmosphere of resistance to the British Raj in India. The situation in 1921 was particularly fraught following the repressive actions of the Sedition Committee of 1918 and the Government of India Act of 1919, which were widely regarded as moving insufficiently far in the direction of representative government. And one of the great crises of empire was caused on the 13th of April 1919 with the so-called Amritsar massacre in the Punjab, in which Brigadier General Reginald Dyer had ordered the army to shoot on a peaceful assembly of unarmed civilians, leaving 379 dead and 1,000 injured, resulting in what Barbara and Thomas Metcalfe describe as the greatest wrenching loss of faith in British rule among the Indian public since the mutiny of 1857-8. At Patcham, the guests included, at the opening, the guests included the laureate of British imperialism, Rudyard Kipling, an extensive representation of the press corps and the Pathé film crew that we've seen. It's interesting to note, though, that the symbolism of the flag that was erected included the emblem of the British Army in India, which shows the Star of India superimposed on the Union Jack. But ironically, this seems very, very close to the image of the Ashokan Chaka, the wheel with 24 spokes, which became the flag of the Indian Republic in 1947. It's almost as if the heraldry prefigures the fall of the British Empire. Nonetheless, the prince, when he spoke, noted that our Indian comrades came when our need was highest, free men and voluntary soldiers who were true to their salt and gave lives in a quarrel of which it is enough for them to know that the enemy were the foes of their sahib. It was enough for them to know that the enemy, the Germans, were the foes of their sahibs, the enemies of the emperor and the king. To the mayor of Brighton, he added, India never forgets a kindness and sympathy, and from this Chattri, a wave of goodwill will pass to India. Such memorials, the Prince of Wales concluded, strengthen ties between India and our country. Despite its obscure location, the monument was not merely local, but also imperial, indeed global, in its address. And although I've not been able to document it, I'm pretty certain that that film that we just watched a tiny episode from would have been shown all over India. Films were shown, for example, at the Bombay Opera House, which opened in 1910, with texts in Hindi, Urdu, and Marathi. And one can imagine that this would be the kind of place where such a film would be shown. With the combination of the local and the global that I've already emphasized, the Times mused on the opening date about the role of the Chattri as a contribution to the deep history of the Sussex Downs with which I began. Not far off, the Times wrote, from what is one of those prehistoric camps which succeeding races, Celts, Britons, Romans, and Saxons are supposed to have occupied. And now, in the 20th century, come those associations, perhaps the strangest of all, of the cremation of Indian soldiers who fought in Flanders in the Great War, and this temple proclaims their fame for all time. But the 20th century was not kind to the Chattri. It was overgrown by 1924, and its deterioration was the subject of an endless sequence of complaints to the Brighton Council. It was subject to various campaigns of rehabilitation. In 1932, a group of British veterans gathered there for a service of commemoration, and from 1951 to 1999, every year the British Legion made an annual pilgrimage to the site, which was abandoned eventually because of the difficulty of arranging tea to be delivered to the vicinity in 1999. But since 2000, in a strange and significant development, members of the local Sikh community of Brighton, led by Davinder Dillon, have continued and transformed this tradition of an annual pilgrimage to remember and honor the Indians who died. Their pilgrimage effectively identifies the Chattri as a kind of proleptic emblem of the multicultural post-imperial Britain of the present day, and specifically the multi-ethnic community of contemporary Brighton. The community also erected a new monument, which you can see here, less inscrutable than the Chattri, which bears the names of all the individuals cremated there, including Mohia Ram, whose funerary rites the Times had reported in 1915. Such monuments bear the imprint of the communities who create them, perhaps more so than they reflect the subjectivities of the soldiers whose bodies were consumed in flames there a century ago. Although not responding directly to the Chattri, it seems to me that this is the underlying, there's the new monument. It seems to me that this is the underlying message of the sculpture temporarily installed by the Indian-born British sculptor Anish Kapoor on the downlands only a few miles from the Patcham Chattri, this sculpture called Sea Curve, which he mounted on a plinth above Brighton during the festival in 2009. Monuments reflect then the preoccupations of those who create them. And when we look into this sculpture of Anish Kapoor, we actually see ourselves reflected back in it, as perhaps we may do in the Chattri. In the Chattri, erected in 1921, we can find traces of the hybrid Mughal Hindu culture of the Indian subcontinent, of the Indo-Saracenic monuments of the British Empire and the great capital city of British India. We can see the hand of a young Indian architect summoned to the imperial centre to learn his trade. Most visible are the ideologies of the British Raj, anxious to be seen to honour the Indian dead, but profoundly committed to hierarchies of class and race that were employed to justify the British presence in India. Hierarchies that gave British soldiers names, but denied the individual identity of Indian servicemen. If we strain to listen, however, still audible are the voices of those Sikh and Hindu men, mainly listed merely as sepoy or riflemen, men like Mangal Singh, drummer of the 19th Punjabis, or the humble Kalu, that's his only name, of the Mule Corps, whose names are now finally visible at Patcham, where their bodies were committed to the fire a century ago. Thank you.